we should probably be arguing passionately about things that are more important.
That's good. But this is surprisingly important. Over the weekend, 2 weeks ago,
Chris and I are arm wrestling right now. Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast. For anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am when I try to fill out those online forms that make me try to prove I'm a human by clicking on pictures of cars, I cannot do it. CAPTCHA. Yeah, every time I do it, it like goes cycles and cycles, and I have to do 4 or 5 different. I can't figure out is the car, the top of the car in that square? And that it counts? Or
every week,
is
Matt,
it like
you're telling us about some daily angst that you're having.
This is my therapy, Don.
Gosh,
I'm
Matt.
saving so much money by doing this podcast.
Maybe you ought to seek professional
what would
help.
be better?
I have a lot of issues, and I'm comfortable with that.
I think better therapy would be if you spent more time on the Population Health Exchange website.
Well, it's funny you
Especially
preempted
in
me.
the winter.
You preempted me.
I understand that it's really, really good in the wintertime.
First of all, it's not wintertime. It's not wintertime. It's still fall time.
Not.
And what happens in fall? What's the best thing about November?
Pumpkins.
No. Thanksgiving. Best thing about fall is Thanksgiving. And in my house...
You don't think Halloween is the best thing?
That's in
not in
October.
November.
I don't know if you know.
That's still fall.
I said November. What's the best thing about November? We're in November now.
No, we're not.
The World Series.
Yes, we are.
No, we're not.
First of all, Chris, you're embarrassing yourself. Stop that. Stop that. October baseball, not November.
Oh, right.
Best thing about
Boys of Summer.
Best thing about November is Thanksgiving, and in my house,
Not Flag Day?
at Thanksgiving, we go around the table. We all say what we're thankful for.
Yeah.
And what I am thankful for this year is many things.
Including the
But
Population
one
Health
of which is the Population Health Exchange website. I am so thankful because you know why? There's something particularly interesting going on, which is that we are now gearing up for the Winter Institute.
Oh, wait a minute. It's only November.
Well, we're gearing up
No,
for
it's
it.
not. It's October.
Stop it. It's November.
But that's not winter either.
I'm saying we're getting ready for it. Oh, my gosh.
Enough.
Okay.
We're getting ready for it. And the Winter Institute, which is going to be a product of the Population Health Exchange website program, will be on January 7th. And the amazing thing this year is it's going to be virtual. So there's going to be live stream courses, including courses on GIS, on story mapping, and on biostatistics. So you can go to the Population Health Exchange website where you can learn more about it, and you can sign up for that Winter Institute. I think you're really going to like it.
Can we also advertise ZipRecruiter?
You always want to. Is the
I
idea
hear
that
about it every time I turn around.
is the idea that if we advertise for them for free, eventually they'll pay us? Is that how it works?
Yeah.
Or is the idea that if you have a podcast, you have to mention ZipRecruiter?
The latter.
Or it's not a podcast?
The latter.
Got it. Anyway, as a reminder, we would love if you go out and give us a rating on your podcast app. It really helps other people find us.
Because we're lost all the time.
We are lost. So I checked. We have 47 ratings so far. So thank you if you are one of the people who gave us a rating. We don't want to brag. I don't want to brag, but we do have a perfect score at the moment.
Perfect. Nothing but ones?
Nothing but some things. I'm not going to say what. We're doing really well. I'm just saying if this was our GPA, we'd get into college. But that is not it. Just we still want more ratings. I'm just saying we got a perfect score like I did on all of my high school exams. Mom, if you're listening, you can verify that, right? Anyway, now on to the show. So today in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to look at a study that looked at the effect of the relationship between exercise and mental health. In the second part, which is our deep dive, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of debunking science. And then in our third segment, which is our amazing and amusing segment, we will get into some things that make us laugh out loud or act like 8th grade boys. And when I wrote that line, my 9th grade daughter told me 8th grade boys actually act more maturely than the three of us do. So do with that what you will. So let's get into it. In segment 1, we're going to get into an article that looks at the effect or claims to look at the effect of or the association of exercise and mental health. The study was published in the journal Lancet Psychiatry, with first author Sami Chekrud of the Oxford Centre for Human Brain Activity at the University of Oxford, although there were other affiliations which I didn't list, so I think it's also associated with Yale. Right? That may be right.
Yeah.
The study was titled Association Between Physical Exercise and Mental Health in 1.2 million individuals in the USA between 2011 and 2015, a cross-sectional study. We can get into the idea of should you include things like facts about your study in the title, like the 1.2 million individuals, or sometimes people will put the finding in the study in the title, and some journals won't allow that.
Confirmation that the Earth is flat.
We can
Right.
Kyrie Irving. Going back to that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Some headlines on this one. So we this one made a lot of headlines. This one, MSN says, science says exercising this much will make you a happier person. Science says. So science is talking. Can too much exercise affect your mental health, says Newsweek? I don't totally get that one.
That's not what they said.
Not at all.
I'm just telling you.
But I think that that's true.
It's probably true, which is why I avoid it.
Regular exercise, quote, best for mental health, says The Independent. Exercise can help those with depression to a point, says the Chicago Tribune. And NBC 12 says exercise really can chase away the blues.
What is NBC 12?
Well, it's like an NBC affiliate. It wasn't like NBC
For 12-year-olds?
national. Yes, it is not.
That's not it.
It's not. Okay, Don, can you give us a rundown on this study?
Yeah. Studies on exercise seem to be really common. I mean, there are a lot of studies out there.
People sure like to run them.
Oh, jeez. Ouch, ouch, ouch. So in any event, there is the authors state that there have been a number of studies on exercise as adjunct therapy for mental health, but there have been relatively few studies that have been large enough and to be able to actually drill down on individual types of exercise and their effect on mental health. And when we say mental health here, we mean primarily depression, I think. So their goal was to measure mental health burden associated with different types of exercises and accounting for sociodemographic and physical health characteristics. So it's a cross-sectional study, and what they used was a CDC-funded behavioral risk factor surveillance survey, which was done between those years that you mentioned in the title, 2011 and 2015, where they did a phone survey of adults over 18 years old in all 50 states, and they got responses from 1,439,000 individuals.
That's a lot of people.
And they asked them questions about demographics, about their physical health, about their mental health, and their health-related behaviors. They claimed that there was relatively few missing data, so the individuals with missing data were excluded, and they just analyzed the remainder, which apparently was...
there was no need to impute for statistical power.
Because there were so few missing data, apparently.
Although imputation is meant to deal with bias, not necessarily, not just power, and we can get into whether or not we think it actually works, but keep going.
So they did this phone interview, and they asked people to self-report on their prior mental health. And the question that they asked was, has a doctor, nurse, or other health professional ever told you that you have a depressive disorder, including depression, major depression, dysthymia, or minor depression? The outcome was likewise asked, and the question was, now thinking about your mental health, which includes stress, depression, and problems with emotions, for how many days during the past 30 days was your mental health not good? And then they described the exercise activities in an open-ended sort of a way, and they kind of grouped all of the different kinds of exercise that people reported doing, and there were 75 different types, and they sort of grouped them all into 8 categories like sports, cycling, aerobic gym, team sports. They also asked the number of times per week, the minutes per session, and the intensity level. And they adjusted for individual level covariates such as age, race, gender, marital status, income, education, level, employment, BMI, which I assume they probably just calculated based on the report by the individual of their height and weight, self-reported physical health, and previous diagnosis of depression. So all of these data are self-reported. So there's nothing that was actually measured. And they compared the self-reported mental health that the individual claimed having and the exercise pattern in the past month. So the whole thing was really limited to the prior 30 days from that phone conversation. And they did separate analysis if people reported having had a history of depression prior to what occurred in the last month. And they did also separate analysis for mindfulness exercises, which they defined as engaging in Tai Chi and yoga. So they ended up, the data set ended up having 1.2 million individuals, which was 86% of the sample. And I can't remember why that 14% was omitted, but the mean days of poor mental health in the past month for the entire group was 3.3 days.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, I suppose. And so what they did is they matched people who had engaged in an exercise in the prior month with those that hadn't. And in that matched data set, they had 852,000 individuals. And when they made that comparison, they found that there were 1.5 days less depression in the prior month if they engaged in exercise.
In the prior month.
In the prior month. And then when looking at individuals who had a prior diagnosis of depression, they found that there was a greater effect. There was a 3.75 day reduction in days being depressed in the prior month. And this was seen across the age span in both genders, in all racial groups, all levels of income, and they showed a decrease in particular, in people who engage in mindful exercise. They even found that there was a 9.7% decrease in depressed days if you engaged in household chores, which is a form of exercise, I suppose.
Washing the dishes.
And then as far as duration and frequency was concerned, they found a U-shaped effect. So the maximum benefit was between 30 and 60 minutes of exercise per session, and 3 to 5 sessions per week was ideal. And if you exceeded that, then the relationship tended to kind of break down. There were more episodes of depression with excessive exercise. And maybe that's people that are just a little too fixated on exercise. And overall, their conclusion was 120 to 360 minutes per week was the most beneficial for individuals.
So little to no exercise supposedly is bad.
Too much exercise.
Moderate exercise is good, and too much exercise is also bad.
Right.
Is their take on this? Chris, what's your...
So I am a broken record.
Yes, you are.
I am a broken record. And this study was
can I guess then what you're going to say?
Selected for my
You're going to say
benefit.
that this entire study is confounded by bees.
Oh, behave.
Behive.
I was going to say something right. I would behive yourself, Matt.
That's a terrible
Buzz,
pun.
I wonder why he does.
Okay.
All right. So I was gonna say, this is a cross-sectional analysis. What we would like to see in terms of trying to generate proof to support the hypothesis that exercise improves your mental health is that you exercised and then your mental health got better. But that is not what they did. What they did was they decided at one point in time how these two phenomenon varied, and then they did some math. And because they had a very large sample size, and Don, I'm going to give you the honors, the p-value was what? 10 to the minus 16?
It was 2.2 times 10 to the minus 16.
That's quite a
I have
p-value.
never seen that.
We are creeping up on Avogadro's number of significance here.
Right.
So,
You wouldn't even be able to find that p-value if it fell on the floor.
Right.
And they had a histogram showing the different kinds of exercise, and they had a little error bar at the top,
And you
which
can't see
you
it?
can't
And
see it. You
it's
just get like a dot at the top of
it's the W statistic, which I think must stand for wow or something. But I don't know.
wacky.
Wacky. Wicked lodge. Anyway, so I'm just going to say that if you were trying to answer this question, you would not ideally go for cross-sectional analysis because it will never answer your question. So I'm just going to read you a quote, which comes straight from the Poets. So this is from their paper.
It was going to be Emily Bronte.
It's from their paper. This is from the methods section in the statistical analysis plan. It says, and listeners, just listen close. With a large sample of participant-level data, this sample afforded a detailed comparison between the various types of exercise in which individuals engage. So far, so good. I said that, not them. We analyzed the effect of exercise type using a hurdle at zero negative binomial regression. Hurdle at zero negative binomial
HURDLE?
regression. We confirmed the presence of zero inflation with a Vuong test comparing a negative binomial regression with a hurdle at zero negative binomial regression. To account for the fact that participants self-select to various exercise types, we applied a multinomial propensity weighting procedure that used generalized boosted regression trees to estimate post-stratification propensity scores. What? I did not understand a word of that. Maybe you got that one.
I understood about 3/4 of it, but what I can tell you is, to me, that sounds not because of what it is, but because of what they're trying to do here is, I had data that can't really answer the question the way I want it to, right?
Bingo.
And therefore, I'm going to do a lot of fancy statistics to try and get over those. Well, no. I'm going to be to be fair to the authors. I think they are trying to deal with the problem. I just don't think these things deal with the problem.
The basic problem
I don't
is
think it's
that
obfuscation. I think it's an attempt.
The
I
basic
just
problem
don't think it works.
is that you cannot prove cause and effect with a cross-sectional study. No
That is
matter
the- that-
how.
no,
No matter what the
no.
flipping... No, I don't...
Not
nope,
true.
Nope,
Not
nope,
true.
Nope, nope.
Not true.
No.
There are cases where you can.
Like what?
Cases where we know for sure that the exposure came before the outcome, i.e. genetics.
Oh. Okay,
So there
that's
are,
one.
my point
Sure.
is, I don't want you...
Okay. But in this construct,
Even then it's hard, I should say. Even then it's hard. I'm just saying,
So
let's
I would-
not throw out cross-sectional studies as...
Fair enough.
As
But
impossible.
I would look at this study design and I would say it's a cross-sectional analysis of these two variables, and we want to know if this causes that. We are not going to be able to answer that question in a cross-sectional analysis,
Yes.
no matter how flippin' huge the sample size is and how small the p-value is. And the fact that they're quoting a p-value of 10 to the minus 16 emphasizes what you've been saying along, is that p-values are ludicrous.
I agree. I agree with that 100%. I mean, I think here the problem with that p-value becomes a false sense of precision.
Precision. They're assuming that tiny p equals therefore causal. They have nothing to do with each other.
Well, so the point of p-values is p-values are calculated under the assumption that you've done the perfect randomized trial.
Right.
When you haven't done that, and people smarter than me point this out all the time, a low p-value tells you that your data are inconsistent with the assumptions of the p-value. One assumption of the p-value is that the null is true. So it could be that your data are consistent with the fact that the null is not true. It could be that your data are inconsistent with the assumption that you've done the perfect randomized trial and that you have a lot of bias. And so a low p-value in this case just tells us that the study is so large, random error is not the problem.
Right.
When random error becomes minimal, systematic error is the dominant form of error. And therefore, the p-value, we don't need p-values here. You can just say, we essentially have no random error. Let's focus on the systematic error. Let's get into the systematic
error. I don't
error.
think the issue is systematic error. I think the question is, like, there are two hypotheses here, right? One is that if you exercise more, will your mental health improve? That's one question.
Yep.
Or is the reverse possibly true, that if people have good mental health, are they more likely to exercise because they're not depressed and sitting on the sofa?
Or if
I mean, and unfortunately,
this is reverse causation.
Right. These data.
Which finally, I agree with you.
Yeah,
You're actually talking about reverse causation.
This is a great example.
This is a great example of reverse causation,
Yeah.
right? This is an example of where those two explanations cannot be teased out regardless of the sample size. And I don't think you need to really read the statistical analysis to realize that a cross-sectional study can never answer this question.
You layer on top of that the lack of relative validity of recall data.
Yeah.
There's no independent verification of what people are saying on the phone is necessarily the reality. I mean, people lie all the time about how much they weigh or how tall they are,
And people also misremember.
or misremember. Right.
But then you get into this sort of like, you start with that basic assumption that, or the basic position that we can't actually tell which of those hypotheses are true regardless of the analysis because of the reverse causality. We don't know what's causing what. So then we get into these curious U-shaped distributions of all these associations between different kinds of exercise and mental health. And I would say that the fact that they're U-shaped really suggests that the reason that people exercise or don't exercise, or exercise a lot or exercise a little bit, is probably not at random, and is very likely confounded with the endpoint. That people who exercise for 3 or 4 hours a day are fundamentally people those who exercise for 30 minutes, 5 times a week.
And I would agree with that. And I think, all those statistical methods that they're trying to use are attempts to deal with those problems. I just don't think you can.
But they can't.
But I don't want to be cynical about those. I mean, they were trying very, very hard to deal with this problem. I just don't think they can. So let me just back up a second here and say, we talk a lot on this program about priors. What do I think about this hypothesis before I ever see the data? And then the data should inform me as to what I should think after I see the data. My prior on this is probably exercise does improve mental health. But my prior on that is the effect size is not very large. Mm-hmm. My assumption is that for some people it might have some benefits and some people it will have no benefits. And then on average, the benefits are probably modest. So I'm going into this, a skeptic on the idea of big effects, but I'm open to the idea that there are effects. So the results sort of in some ways fit with what I believe. They are just overestimates of what I believed. My point is, I'm not because I share all your concerns, Chris, doesn't mean I think that the study hypothesis is necessarily wrong. I'm just saying
I agree
it
with you on
doesn't
that.
prove it.
I agree with that. It doesn't move the needle either way, to my mind.
See, to me, it's just so wrapped up in this reverse causality that I don't think you can even take away anything, because you just don't know really what's reality, because I think everybody in the world has experienced periods when they're not feeling all that great and
they don't want to exercise.
And they don't want to exercise.
Yeah.
So that to me is the completely clear and self-evident takeaway from this. That
I feel during the academic year mostly.
So why did this study get so much press then?
Because it tells people what they want to hear, that exercise will make them feel better. And maybe that's true. But it's also, I'm sure that Don is right, that depressed people don't want to exercise. And so that's also in these data. And we don't know which of those is the dominant force. Like if you have a depressed, non-exercising person, you force them to exercise every day, you get a personal trainer, drag them out of bed and force them to run, for 30 minutes, 5 times a week. Is their mental health going to improve? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. But
this paper doesn't tell us that.
This paper does not move our insight one direction or the other, just because the basic study design, regardless of the complicated statistics, cannot answer the question. So why bother? That was my takeaway on this.
Yeah, I do want to emphasize that I don't want to throw out cross-sectional studies across the board. There are times when cross-sectional studies have been incredibly influential and important, and I do want to emphasize that. They do come they start off disadvantaged in many cases, and this is one where I really do think they do. You guys hit all of my key points except for one, which is a bit of a riff on what Don already brought up, which is, Don, you said, you ask people about their mental health, and you ask people about their exercise habits, and people misreport, they misremember, you get it wrong for whatever reason. And we won't get into what those reasons are. But we talked about it once before in this program, but that misclassification tends to lead to errors that are at least predictable in a particular direction if they are non-differential, if they're independent of each other. Whether or not you have poor mental health doesn't make you more likely to misreport your exercising and vice versa. That tends to bias towards the null. If they do depend on that, the bias might go in other directions. It's very hard to say. But where you can get big problems is something that we talked about it once before, is when you get what are called dependent errors or correlated errors, which is when the error in one key variable is correlated with the error in another key variable. So the idea being, if I ask you if you have, they specifically said, have you been told you have a mental health? What was the question? Do you remember? Have you been told you have depression?
Yeah,
or anxiety, or
I can't remember exactly how it was
series of them.
And then you ask about how much did you exercise. And there are certain people who are,
it's a depressive disorder, including depression, major depression, dysthymia, or minor depression.
Have you been told you have one of those, right?
Right.
And you have certain people who will say, well, they sort of think, well, I've never been told that by a health professional, but I have
feel
those.
depressed.
I have those, so I'm going to say yes.
Yeah.
And then you say, do you exercise? Have you been exercising? You say, I did some exercise, but you know what? Mostly I've just been sitting around. So I'm going to discount the exercising that I actually did. And I'm going to say, no, I did none. And now you have a correlation there. And you get people who go in the opposite direction. You get people who say, well, yes, I've been diagnosed with one of those conditions, but I don't identify with that. I've got it under control. So no, I'm going to say no. Did you exercise? And then you say, oh, I was out there every day.
Absolutely,
and,
yes.
And so you get these correlations, and it doesn't take that many of those people to create large amounts of bias in your data when you get these double misclassifications. And the double misclassifications are always going to happen to an extent. We expect that if both variables are misclassified. It's when it's greater than the expectation that we have real problems. And the way you prevent that is you don't ask, you don't get the same, your exposure and your outcome information from the same source. So you ask about exercise, and then you go to the medical record for a diagnosis.
Right.
When you ask the same person, their biases filter into the misclassification, and it makes it very hard to say that we can be really confident in the data, even if there was no problem with reverse causation, even if there was no problem with the confounding. The misclassification alone is going to leave me quite skeptical.
Yeah.
So that would improve upon the already problems associated with a cross-section with a cross-sectional study.
It creates even more problems.
So this approach creates even more problems. The way you're suggesting is a way to sort of take a step away from that and perhaps improving the reliability of the data.
You could have improved the study by going to medical records.
Right.
You could also have improved it in the sense that you could probably have identified that you were talking about exercise now with the people on the phone, but the diagnosis was in the past, which would have been a help. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be a help.
It's a really interesting contrast from the study that we talked about for the last podcast, where all the data came from different sources, but it was all sort of verifiable data, and none of it was self-reported.
And you had the time order as well.
Yeah, right. And so that just for listener reference, that was the diclofenac study.
That's the one we did back in October?
That's one we did in October,
Right. We should do this.
And it's still October for some reason.
Not. It's November.
It's November. It's the Ides of November. So is this sort of a variant of recall bias then? Is that I think
fall
in that rubric?
Recall bias tends to be differential error. It's when people who actually have been diagnosed with one of these conditions are more likely to misreport. So you got the one variable, might be correct,
but it predicts, women who've unfortunately had a miscarriage and then are asked, "Did you drink coffee while you were pregnant?" and they're traumatized by the event and looking to find a reason. So they over recall the exposure of interest.
Whereas here, what we're concerned about is both variables being misclassified.
Right.
And the reasons why they are both misclassified is correlated.
Right.
And that moves people from those, unexposed, undiseased to the exposed, diseased cell
Interesting.
of your 2x2 table, or vice versa. And that really messes with your results.
So you're saying misclassifications tend to party together?
When you ask by self-report, yes. I like that.
Yeah, I think it's good. This is a great teaching example. I think it's one should go in front of our students.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on. And in our second segment, we want to talk about the pros and cons of debunking science. So we, on this program, spend a lot of time talking about science.
But not debunking, critiquing.
Critiquing. Well, in particular, we specifically try to critique, and we try very hard to call things as we see it. And in particular, when we see good science, we like to call that out. And we also, at least we should be emphasizing, and I hope we do, that all research is on a continuum, that every study has some source of bias and error in it. And it's a question of how far and how much we think that study's going to move the needle for, on our prior, based on how good we think that study is. And that is why we spent an entire episode critiquing one of our own studies, to make the point that we're not sitting up and judging everything. Our studies can be critiqued as well. Everything has these problems, and you have to be able to draw the line and be able to interpret a study in light of its errors, but also move forward as a field. And the concern that came up that prompted this particular topic was a conversation that the three of us were having around the idea that if you spend a lot of time critiquing science, do you give material and ammunition to those who are out to get science? Do you give them material to say science is simply useless and bad, when in fact that is not at all our aim? Our aim is to simply point out the cases where the science could have been better and think about ways we can do it better, and not to just to say that our particular field of science is bogus. That is not what I think the three of us believe, and I think it's a concern. How much time do we spend on critiquing when that critique can be used against us by people with ulterior motives? Don, what are your thoughts?
It was an interesting and spirited discussion we had yesterday about this very topic, and I was thinking about whether we would be having these thoughts, having these concerns if it were 5 or 10 years ago. And my sense is that I would be personally less concerned about this particular topic if it was 5 or 10 years ago, because the climate has changed. And I really
literally and figuratively.
Yeah, right. And I really worry whether the listeners or anybody who's involved in this is going to take away the wrong message from what we're saying. Because are we providing fuel for this fire that is anti-science? That are we undermining in some way the whole enterprise of the generation of truth and generation of scientific findings, particularly now when there are forces in this country that are really actively trying to delegitimize the scientific enterprise? And that's something that the three of us absolutely so clearly believe in, almost religiously, that there is a truth and that we can find a truth, and if we do it systematically through experimentation or rigor, we can get there. Maybe not immediately, but we can eventually get there. And to be doing this podcast in the service of that, but possibly undermining that, gives me great disquiet. And so, in the course of our discussions, I think I sort of thought it would be worthwhile for us to reach out to the listeners and say, do you think that certainly that's not our intent, and hopefully that's not coming across as our intent, but do you think that could possibly be one of the unintended consequences of what we're trying to do, that it could be feeding into this climate of questioning science, and science being not as rigorous or as importantly trying to achieve the truth as we think it is.
Yeah. Well, we've all shared this anxiety, and I don't think that's what we're doing. And I know it's not what we're doing.
Our intention.
The question is, how is it being received by the listeners? That's what I'd like to know. And this is an invitation to the listeners to give us feedback about that.
Last year, you and I published this paper about pertussis vaccines and why we thought that pertussis was coming back in the era of the switch to acellular pertussis vaccines. And if you could synthesize that paper in one sentence, it's like we have two vaccines, one is better than the other, and we're trying to figure out why. Right? I mean, that was the point of the paper. Now, on Facebook, this paper was taken up by the anti-vaccine movement as justification from the scientists that vaccines don't work.
Perfect example.
We did not say that. Right. We said one of these vaccines is better than the other. We wanted to find out why. Not that vaccines are bad. That was not the message. And so I think it is a fallacy in some ways to think that we can inoculate ourselves against people who are at baseline predisposed to disbelieve science and looking for opportunities to do that by finding errors within science as therefore justification that science is misleading us. So I think there's no escaping this, because it is in some ways become almost a dogmatic or philosophical movement or a matter of faith rather than a matter of rational discourse. And I don't think we can escape that. So if that's true, we don't need to worry so much that we're feeding that frenzy, because there's nothing we can do to stop it. Instead, we should focus on our core mission, which is, I think, to take the people who are receptive, who are engaged in the scientific mission, and say, listen, folks, we believe in science, and yet science is incredibly complicated. It is messy. It is frequently wrong. Maybe 80% of the time what you read is wrong. Maybe that's true. I mean, I don't know if that is accurate, but John Ioannidis says that it's probably about 80% is wrong. So, but that doesn't mean that we are not, on average, over time, moving in the right direction of truth. And what we need to do, therefore, is to make people less religious about believing in science as a reflex, like our students who see it published in the Lancet and therefore think it is true. I think our mission is to show that because it is in the Lancet, it may be false, or it may be irrelevant, or it may be flawed, it may be partially correct, but not quite. And here are the limitations of why it's not quite so correct. I mean, I think, what we are trying to do is to promote a healthy usership of science, a skeptical interpretation of the literature, so that people are less likely to just believe it as a matter of faith, and perhaps through that we will get a more informed consumer and of science, and better decisions made on the basis of scientific findings than what we're seeing right now, which is often poor, frankly.
I hope that's right. I really do. I think part of the problem that we suffer, or we're dealing with here, is that we in the scientific community play by a set of rules. Not everyone plays by them, and not all the rules are good rules. I mean, p-values and statistical significance aren't part of the rules that we play by, in that many journals won't accept a paper that doesn't have a statistically significant finding, and we don't think that's a good thing, but that is at least part of the rules right now, and we can play by it or not play by it. But we're all within the rough confines of the boundaries of what we consider to be appropriate in science. And part of our science is being critical of the literature, and that is what the peer review system is largely about. We are trying to critique in order to make things better. That works, I think, pretty well. It certainly doesn't work as well as it should. I think we would all agree that the peer review system doesn't work as well as it should, and certainly the publication system doesn't work as well as it should, in that it publishes a lot of things that it probably shouldn't. But once you move outside of the rules of science that we are playing by, those rules don't apply. And so those who are looking to discredit science can point to any single flaw they want as completely discrediting the entire paper, the entire science, the entire field, whatever it is, because they're not playing by those same rules that I think we're playing by, which is to say that just because I identify a flaw in a paper doesn't mean I throw it out. I have to try and see if there are ways that I can account for it, hopefully in a quantitative way. But sometimes my only options are at least to think about it and carefully try to assess it and be cautious about my interpretation and build a body of evidence before I draw conclusions. Those outside aren't playing by those rules. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by talking only to ourselves. Now, I am the first to admit I'm terrible at talking to non-scientists about science, or talking to people outside of my particular field. But I think we do ourselves a disservice because we're talking about the flaws. And that exposes us to anyone coming in from the outside and saying, scientists themselves are saying it. This is you shouldn't believe this.
It's not so.
And it's very easy to take the criticisms that we put towards studies and therefore completely dismiss everything.
Cynically, it's not so dissimilar from what we're seeing with the delegitimization of news.
Absolutely.
Of journalism. This is a whole phenomenon of fake news and fake science. They really are movements that are moving in tandem as an attempt to delegitimize, the purveyors of inconvenient truths. The fact that the New England, that the New England Journal of Medicine published an article that was retracted does not mean that all the science in the New England Journal of Medicine is wrong. Just as when the New York Times goes on record with a source who later retracts their claim, and there goes the foundation of the story, doesn't mean that everything that the New York Times writes is false. And yet that argument is made constantly.
Yeah.
I would hope that the takeaway from some of the things that we talk about, some of the things that we do, is that a part of the understanding and a part of the equation of accepting what's put out there as fact or as scientific conclusion is contributed greatly by the preponderance of evidence, which means the replicability of the information, so that it's not any one individual study, right or wrong, that really determines what the final relationship is. It's really a body of evidence, and I think part of the problem is that the people who claim who go against the grain and claim certain individuals' scientific conclusions as being representative of junk science maybe are cherry picking some of this data. And I think what I believe is that we need to look at the preponderance of evidence. We need to look at research that looks at a particular phenomenon from many different directions, all achieving consensus about a particular relationship. And as we said before, that is particularly challenging with respect to the non-physical sciences, the biological sciences and the health sciences. I think it's a lot easier with physics and the physical sciences, which is why I personally am so distressed by people calling out climate change science as being fake science or junk science, and they don't believe it. And there are one or two outliers where all of the conclusions are pinned on the outliers that don't go with the overwhelming consensus.
But I agree with you 100%. But we can be as upset by that as we want, and we can be as frustrated and pound our fists on the table. But if we can't communicate to the average person, by average person I mean people without the training that we have in our particular field, what they are, what these anti-climate people, or in our case, anti-vax or whatever it is, arguments are making aren't therefore reasons to throw out the field, we're going to lose.
Well, I hope that that's what we're doing. I hope that's why I'm here, in part.
Yeah.
I hope that is the net result. And again, I'm inviting our listeners to give us feedback with respect to, are we succeeding or are we not succeeding?
And I think that's the key. I think we need as much feedback as we can on do we put enough emphasis on thinking about things in the context of the larger picture of the research, as opposed to just the fact that we can put flaws. I mean, we usually try to sum up every episode with where we come down on things, which takes into account the totality and not just the fact that we could find flaws. So I go back to the episode we did a couple weeks back on diclofenac. Did I pronounce that correctly?
It was in October, right?
It was back in October when, we found flaws with that study, but overall we thought it was a really strong contribution to the field. Other studies we've looked at, we think,
not so much.
Not so much. And, did we want to think about in those cases, how do we do it better? How could you do this same study but really get to the answer that we want? And I think so. Our hope is to try and improve things. Yeah. If we miss that mark, we want to hear about it.
Yeah. Well, it's why we're public health educators and professors, is that we're not merely doing science because we love science, but we're here because we also have the opportunity to teach. Yeah. And by doing that, we are creating a larger number of individuals who can be skeptical, inquired, informed, consumers of science.
Okay, so let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. Let's move on to our last segment, which is our Amazing and Abusing segment. This is where we want to highlight some of the things that make us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do. Our look at the weird and wacky things that happen, as well as those things that just inspire us. Don, you wanna go first?
Sure. Let me ask a question first to you two guys.
Okay.
Do you put one or two spaces after the period in a sentence when you're writing?
Two spaces, and this is a really important issue. And
I'll
tell you why in a second.
Hold on.
It's one, okay. And I will fight Chris to the death on this.
There we go. Perfect setup.
It's one.
I did not know this. There is a raging controversy,
two
and you're hearing about it right now.
It's
all right. So apparently the American.
I'm not going to get past this.
Hold on.
I have nightmares.
Hold on. Apparently the American Psychological Association just changed their style manual to go from 1 to 2
They're wrong.
spaces. That prompted a
Next, we're all going to use the Oxford comma.
That prompted 3 researchers from Skidmore, Rebecca Johnson, Becky Bui, and Lindsay Schmidt, to do a series of experiments to determine if we can empirically measure whether there is in fact a benefit in terms of reading speed and reading comprehension with 2 spaces versus 1 space.
Oh, there's no question. There's no question. One is better.
So they go through this long description of
I want
why,
to see the replicability on this.
of why two spaces might affect your parafoveal information. So which is really the space just to the side of where you're looking.
Okay.
And whether you need two spaces after the period so that you have less confused line of sight.
More blank space.
More blank space. Okay, I have to admit, this is an argument for the two spaces I've never heard before, and I'm intrigued. Go.
So they did a series of experiments where they collected a bunch of 60 students at Skidmore College who were native speakers of American English, and they determined whether they were two spacers or one spacers first to see what the input was, and then they had them read a series of paragraphs on a computer screen. And those paragraphs would be either one-spaced or two-spaced. And they did it also with the comma, one space after the comma internal to the sentence, or two spaces.
As like an internal control, you mean?
As an internal control. Wow. And they also had this very fancy device that measured within a very small distance where their eyesight was looking. And they tracked, as people were reading, whether they dwelled at the end of the sentence excessively long based on whether it was two or one spaces.
I'm intrigued.
And so one of the take-home messages were that there's a graph where they look at reading speed, and there's a clear advantage to being a two-spacer as opposed to being a one-spacer. Two-spacers read considerably faster than one-spacer. Now, these are the individuals in terms overall of their reading speed, not in terms of whether they were reading two-space or one-space paragraphs. When it got down to it, they ended up concluding that two-space paragraphs, regardless of whether you are a one-spacer or a two-spacer, afforded a 3% increase in reading speed with no penalty on reading comprehension.
Wow.
So I just really enjoyed the very last sentence of the discussion where they said, thus, while period spacing does influence our processing of text, we should probably be arguing passionately about things that are more important.
That's good. But this is surprisingly important. Over the weekend,
I can't believe it.
Over the weekend, 2 weeks ago,
Chris and I are arm wrestling right now.
We had a guest over. One of my daughters is applying to college, and the guest was very cognizant with the evaluation process for student essays at colleges. And this individual said, one of the things they look for as they're reading those essays is whether they're two spaces or one space.
Seriously?
No.
Yes, no. But the reason why is that the two space is a generational thing because we all learned that in typing.
Right. That's where it comes from.
That's right.
It's an anachronism.
Space, tap, tap.
I never did.
It's an anachronism. From
So they use this as a poor man's way of telling whether the parents wrote the essay.
Oh, interesting. But
I
I don't
wow.
think. Hopefully, they're not making conclusions based on that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's sort of a further variation on the theme of looking for plagiarism by googling text. So this was the two space, especially when you see transitions within a paragraph where there's sections that are two space and sections that are one space, and you can tell which was written by mom and which was written by the applicant. And that's how they view it. I was like, wow.
And they really make a conclusion based on that?
Well, it's one of the things that they go into it. It's like, that was a really great essay, but
It's a two-spacer.
It's a two-spacer.
I don't like the two spaces, but
Apparently
I'm intrigued.
not.
Well, 3%.
Yeah.
They don't talk about all the things you lose as a double spacer.
Space, for example.
All the time that you're spending hitting that space bar an extra
second time, right.
You calculate that over a lifetime and think about how many years of your life
could
you're
have gone to
losing.
Florida.
You'll never get
Could
that
have gone to
time back
Florida. You
again.
couldn't because you're a double spacer. I'm going on vacation. Chris is not.
That's right. There it is.
Chris, what do you got for us?
Well, the vocabulary word today is not Windsorization.
Yeah, I like that one. I picked that one up too.
Frugivore.
Which means eating fruit.
Frugivore?
So this is a study that I found that I really liked about fruit scent. And fruit scent is an evolved signal to primate seed dispersal published in Science.
Okay, you're going to have to go into some more detail because I didn't get that.
I was watching this video today about how to choose a good cantaloupe in the supermarket, and one of the things that they say you should do is you should sniff the stem.
How is today different from any other day? That's what you do every day.
Look at videos
of fruit. I see you in your office.
I used to do cats.
Yeah.
But now I've moved on to cantaloupes.
So you sniff the stem, did you say?
Moving through the seeds. You sniff the cut place where the stem was, and if you can smell the sort of the ethene smell, the fruit, the juicy fruit gum smell, it's a good ripe cantaloupe.
Okay.
So that's one way. Now, the issue here is like whether plants that make fruits, that make fleshy fruits that are going to be the main food source for animals, co-evolve with the sensory apparatus of the animals that are eating the fruit.
Oh, so in other words, as the animal that's seeking out this fruit changes, it's got to evolve so that it can be found.
Eaten, right, because the fruit's goal
and it's got to be eaten.
Is to be eaten so that those seeds will be in the stool of the animal, and the animal will go off and see the seeds somewhere else.
That's cool.
Like a classic example of this are pimentos, right? Birds scatter pimentos. Birds don't have teeth, and so when they eat a chili pepper, they don't grind up the seeds and destroy them. And so the chili is designed to discourage mammals from eating pimentos.
Really?
Hot peppers, because we have sensors that can detect capsaicin. Birds do not. And so it is a strategy to discourage rodents from eating the peppers and encourage birds to eat the peppers.
Cool.
Which is very cool. But this study is about lemurs and fruits and birds and fruits. And so there are different kinds of fruits that can ripen in different ways, and some will ripen by turning a bright red color, like an apple. Like when you go to the store, you choose the apples that are the reddest often.
Yes.
Because they look delicious.
They do. But especially red delicious.
And you can also choose fruit based on their smell. They smell great, and so you want to eat them. And so a fruit plant that is being eaten by something with a great sense of smell is going to want to optimize its fruity smell, and it's going to time that fruity smell to when the fruit is ripest so that it can optimize the seed's success rates. Whereas if you're being eaten by something that doesn't have a good sense of smell, then it doesn't matter, and you should go with a visual cue instead. And so it turns out that in Madagascar, where there are relatively few birds and relatively few bats, which are the other things that eat fruits, but lots of lemurs which eat fruits, you can do this sort of experiment because the lemurs are mostly nocturnal and sometimes what are called cephemeral,
crepuscular,
cathemeral, which means that they're like insomniac, and they're either up all day or up all night, and they're just kind of all around. But a lot of the time they're up feeding at night. Lemurs have excellent senses of smell based on a huge olfactory bulb, but they are colorblind, and they often feed at night. And so sight is irrelevant to their feeding behavior, or less important. And so you would hypothesize that the fruits that those lemurs like to eat would be the ones that have the strongest smell, and that the ratio of ripe to unripe fruit would be a higher gradient, because the fruit wants to be eaten when it's ready to be, when the seeds are ready, which is when it ripens. Yep. And it turns out that it is absolutely true, that not only are the fruits that lemurs like to eat, most delicious smelling at the time that is optimal for seed dispersion, but they actually change the volatile organic compounds in the smell so that it's not just a matter of volume of the VOCs, but it is a different kind of smell that is even more delicious. So it is a trigger to say to the lemur, now is the time to eat meat. And they could sort of validate this by following troops of lemurs around in the jungles of Madagascar with binoculars and watching them, with guava fruits or whatever they eat. And they would then count the number of times that they would pick up a guava fruit and smell it before they bit it. Taste to see if it smells good. And they found that, there was a clear gradient, and the smellier they would go for that. And then the control for this was the birds, who have very poor sense of smell.
Hard for a bird to pick up something.
But they have excellent color vision. And lemurs are colorblind, and birds have great color vision. And so you would think that birds are going to be looking for the reddest apples, metaphorically.
Yeah.
And that is also true.
Not metaphorically.
But whatever the fruits are. But they're looking for them because they look delicious rather than they smell delicious at night.
And that's what happens?
And that's what happens. And that the gradient and the increase of the smell from a ripe to an unripe fruit is minimal with those kinds of fruits, even within the same species of flowering fruit. Families.
And it seems like, and this would make sense, right? Because if you are the one that looks the most attractive at the right time, you're the one who's going to get eaten
by the bird,
and the seed is going to get dispersed, and that one will go on. Whereas the one that doesn't have the signal is going to die.
So they're using different signals for different consumers of those seeds. I thought it was just
is so
wonderful.
cool.
I don't know what it has to do with public health, but I really liked this paper.
Most of what I'm about to say has nothing to do with public health. I got a short one. So everybody knows that academics are some of the funniest people in the world,
That
right?
is so true.
Really funny. Just
We're
humorous
hysterical.
people. So have you seen the hashtag that's been going around? That's the hashtag academic movie titles.
No.
So this is academics coming up with movie titles that would explain the life of an academic. And this has been circulating on Twitter. So I'm going to give you some of my favorite ones here. Rebel Without a Grant. Crouching Data, Hidden P-Value.
Oh, no.
Silence of the Editor. Rebel Without a Causal Model. A Clear and Present Deadline.
Oh, no.
Dr. Strange Thesis. There Will Be Typos.
That's a good one.
Reviewer 2 in the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Article Submission. I Know What You Did Last Sabbatical. And then, because I couldn't resist, I had to get in on this. The one I put in was Raiders of the Lost Journal Submission Password.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God.
Anyway, had fun with that one.
That's very good.
So that is the end of our program. If you got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a topic or a study for us to take on, you can tweet us at @PopHealthyX, or you can tweet me at @ProfMattFox, or Chris at @ID.Gill, or Don at @DTheo1. Or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthyx.org. And don't forget to go sign up for the Winster Institute. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will download that next episode. Bye-bye.